Welcome to the CRE Report. Today we're talking land, America's balance sheet, how we can leverage this balance sheet to eventually pay down our debt and maybe one day actually even pay a citizen's dividend. Think Alaska, right? How Alaska utilizes all their natural resources. If you're a citizen of Alaska, whether you're 1 or 100, you get this check from the state because of how they utilize those natural resources. Did you know that the United States of America, the Interior Department, they have over 500 million acres of land that they manage? I think the question that we want to be asking ourselves as obviously citizens of America is, so what does that mean for our balance sheet? Do you have any idea what the value of those 500 million acres are for our nation's balance sheet? Didn't think so, because either do we. We have no idea at this point. So former North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum, now our current Secretary of Interior, was recently on the All In podcast. And I want to play for you some of that because they talked about America's balance sheet and how we can begin to leverage that balance sheet to ultimately pay down our debt. And I want to walk you through some clips also from Interior Secretary Burgum's confirmation hearing, where he goes into more detail about utilizing the balance sheet, really understanding the balance sheet. The sad thing is right now, you're going to hear in some of these clips, Governor Doug Burgum suggesting our balance sheet could be $100 trillion. We don't know. But even if it is $100 trillion, last year, the Interior Department got a $22 billion return on all of its assets. Like less than 1% of it even is $100 trillion. So very poor returns. And he's saying, look, we've got to do a much better job to utilize and leverage this balance sheet for the American people. So I want to jump into some of these clips for you. I may pause along the way if he's got something that really stands out. But
so the crisis that we're in from energy is not the only crisis America faced. We're facing a debt and deficit crisis that's going to challenge this nation in ways we've never been challenged before. $38 trillion of debt, $6.75 trillion budget, $2 trillion deficit. The numbers are staggering. It's frightening. There's a lot of economic studies that show you can't tax more than 18% of GDP or else you lose GDP. We're at that point. You've talked a lot about America's balance sheet as a way to unlock opportunity to grow GDP and grow our way out of this deficit debt problem. Talk a little bit about what you mean when you say America's balance sheet. What does that entail?
Well, first of all, I love, David, the way you're framing it. And I would just add, the $2 trillion deficit means that in the last year of the Biden administration, 2,000 billion more was spent than came in. And coming in, we have other ways to bring money in other than taxes. And how is that possible? Well, it's because of America's balance sheet. Our balance sheet isn't just the financial assets. It includes the fact that just within Interior alone, there's 500 million acres of surface land. Throw in U.S. Forest Service, add another 200 million.
That's like nearly a third of U.S. land.
Yes. And then we have 700 million acres of subsurface, sometimes continuous and some discontinuous, but we own all these minerals that are underground. Then there's about, between 2.5 and 3 billion acres of offshore that contain critical minerals and oil and gas minerals. All of that is under the federal purview. If Interior was a standalone company, it would have the largest balance sheet in the world by so far. I mean, Saudi Aramco wouldn't even come close. And then you say, okay, well, if you have this, we all know about the $38 trillion in debt. It gets, hammered all the time. It's used in campaign things. But I was, even at the Hill and Valley conference this week, without asking the audience, okay, how many know the 38 trillion? Everybody. How many of you know what our balance sheet on the asset side is? Well, nobody knows because none of the senators know because we haven't calculated, but we're working in the Trump administration to try to come up with that number. And in one estimate this week.
Just think about that for a moment. Like, here's this giant balance sheet, and we have no idea what the value of that balance sheet of our entire nation is. That these are our resources as citizens. These are our resources. We have no idea.
Because we think just on public land alone, there may be $8 trillion of coal resources. And I know coal is sometimes,
it's a dirty word.
It is, but we need to also remember that if we're going to have steel in this country, and we all agree need to have a steel industry. We need to have for defense. We need to have it.
There's a whole other conversation around coal because of what we know is happening right now with the AI war with China. And so China's putting a ton of coal online. We have not been as of late. That obviously is probably going to change underneath the Trump administrations. That may be for another video.
For advanced manufacturing, we also need to have a shipping industry that comes back to our country. You need steel for that. Well, guess what you make steel out of? Well, part of it you make it out of, you need coke, and coke comes from a certain kind of metallurgical coal. So if we kill the coal industry, you can't have a steel industry unless we're going to have somebody ship metallurgical coal to us. In the coal resources around our country, the coal is also filled up with the critical and rare earth minerals that we need to go in this battle with China, particularly now with China just in weeks ago putting on export controls on a number of minerals that we need for doing things like batteries that we need for electric motors, for whether it's cars or home drills or rockets, missiles. I mean, the magnets that are at risk now because we became so dependent on China. So when you take a look at this balance sheet, we need it for defense, we need it for national security. But Theodore Roosevelt, who was instrumental in putting away these hundreds of millions of acres in the original intention, that said this was there for the benefit and use of the American people. And he also said very explicitly that conservation meant sustainable use, not just preservation. Because we saw what happened, following the extremism that landed around the spotted owl, which is, we've got to stop not just the harvesting of certain old growth timbers. It killed the timber industry in America. And when we killed it back in the 1990s, and it's never come back. And now what's happening 30 years later, because those timber companies that would get a lease from the federal government, they would have the responsibility for going in and thinning and cleaning and responsibly managing that. And they would send a check to the federal government. We'd have revenue. Instead of revenue today, we have expense. We burn more board feet of lumber in this country every year right now than we are harvesting because of
the wildfires.
Because of uncontrolled wildfires. And then the uncontrolled wildfires are some of our biggest emitters, in terms of CO2. You burn a tree, it releases the carbon. So again, the folks that wanted to, reduce emissions, save the planet, help the wildlife, we're actually doing the opposite of that. So we have to get back in the business of grazing our lands, managing our forests, developing our resources and our critical minerals. Getting back, we have to mine again in this country. Mining can't be, if we want to be a strong country, we've got to do that. And of course, oil and gas. You do all of those things that I just named. All of those involve selling a lease to a private company. They send a check, and then they develop the resource, and then they send us a royalty. The little company that I just met with this morning out on the platform on the Gulf of America, in its inception, this is a company with 450 people. They have sent $1.2 billion to the U.S. Treasury over the life of their company. Show me a tech company that's done that. I mean, impossible.
For a lease to access that resource.
Well, so powerful. The way I like he puts it, because if you don't know, Secretary of Interior Burgum has got a big tech background. For him to call it tech like that and talk about the revenues that some of these smaller companies are generating for the federal government, very, very powerful.
Well, the lease, and they lease it up front, so they write a check up front to have the opportunity to take the risk. They take all the risk. They build the platform. They hire the people. They do the seismic. They figure it out. And if they hit a dry hole, it's all on them, taxpayer, nothing. But if they score, then they pay us a royalty. And what do we use that for? We use it for paying down the deficit and the debt. We also use it for coastal restoration. Along this beautiful Gulf Coast.
You do coastal restoration with that.
The dollars go back to the states. The largest funder of coastal restoration in this country is the oil and gas industry, here in the Gulf. So again, like I said, if you've driven on an
So there's a lot to this interview. It's fantastic. I want to play for you now some clips from now again. Secretary of Interior Burgum's confirmation hearing as well. This is an exchange with Senator Mike Lee. Again, talking about the balance sheet. And I want to play this for you because when Secretary Burgum was the governor of North Dakota, he did a great job of looking at our state's balance sheet. If you're not familiar with the state of North Dakota, they've got what's called a legacy fund. Unfortunately, law there, I hope this changes. They're not able to pay a citizen's dividend, if you will, similar to Alaska. But they've got this legacy fund now because of the oil and gas revenues. It's got billions and billions of dollars in it for a state of roughly 700,000 people. So they too have done a great job utilizing the resources, the natural resources from that state. You're going to hear in a little bit about the money that's in a K through 12 education fund as well. I think some people in North Dakota like to see it go back into their pockets a little bit more directly, but that again is a conversation for another day. Most importantly, what I want to have you hear here is we talk about this balance sheet is how do we begin to look at what's the actual value of this balance sheet? And then, of course, the next conversation is how do we produce much better returns on this balance sheet? So again, this is Senator Mike Lee, the confirmation hearing for our now Secretary of Interior, Doug Burgum.
I want to talk to you briefly about the fact that public lands represent a massive public asset, and yet a lack of an accurate valuation is something that we don't have, and that undermines informed decision-making about their use and their management. What steps would you take, if confirmed as secretary, to improve the transparency in this area and ensure federal land valuations reflect their value to the American people?
Well, I would just say on this idea that what I'll call America's balance sheet is something that the Trump administration has quite a bit of enthusiasm in discussions with Treasury nominee Scott Bessent, Commerce nominee Howard Lutnick, and even Speaker Mike Johnson.
One quick note, as he mentions, Commerce Secretary Lutnick, is the fact that it was Mr. Lutnick that it was a big, he pushed very strongly for our sovereign wealth fund. And so keep in mind, look at what Norway has, right? Knowing that we could utilize and leverage this balance sheet much more effectively, you pay down the debt. Eventually now you've got money going into our sovereign wealth fund, which ultimately then could become some sort of citizens dividend. There's more to that conversation, but start to think out into the future of taking these assets, the minerals, the land, the other things that our great nation now has as a resource. You put it on the blockchain so you can actually have real valuations of what's happening here. We understand how to better leverage these assets. Maybe it's public-private partnerships. Those have been very, very successful in some different domains, maybe infrastructure, for example. So you put together these public-private partnerships, you've got the sovereign wealth fund. Next thing you know, all these assets are on a blockchain. You're paying out a citizen's dividend. It could be multiple ways to do that. I don't want to get into that now, but hopefully you can see where this potentially can go if we can actually get a real valuation of our balance sheet and how to better leverage this to get a much better return for the American people. And Secretary Burgum is going to talk about this in just a moment.
Johnson called me a few weeks ago and said, "Hey, what's this American balance sheet idea?" I mean, I think for our standing in the world, for us to, talk nonstop about what our liabilities are, we should also be fluent, just as any business would be, to be able to talk about what our assets and the assets of this country, I think, outpace any place in the world because of the care that we've given, in particular to the public lands, the surface, the subsurface, and the offshore. And we've proven time and time again that we can do it better, cleaner, and safer than anyone else here. If I'm a timber company and I own timberland and it's not been harvested, I put that on my balance sheet. If I've got timberland and I've planted young trees, I put it on my balance sheet at a different valuation. When we protect U.S. lands and then don't cut a tree and then they burn down, we not only produce enormous amounts of emissions and enormous amounts of carbon, but we also have effectively wasted the public's asset. And I think it's part of our duty in the role, if I have the privilege of being nominated here, but all of us as elected officials, to make sure that we're getting a return on the nation's balance sheet for the benefit and the use of the American people.
This is important to know. You may have seen an interview with Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan, obviously. And so he talked about it as well. He goes, look, I think every single department should know, hey, this is what we spent and this is the return that we got on what we put out from our spending perspective from every single department. That sounds crazy to many of us because things have been so mismanaged within our government. But imagine every single department would say, hey, we spent X amount of money. Here's the return we got. What I didn't play for you in the clip, because there's so much in an interview from the All In podcast, is where Governor Burgum talked about, hey, let's just say we've got $100 trillion balance sheet for our nation, right? From an interior perspective. He goes, the thing is with the Interior Department last year, it generated $22 billion. Like, even if it was just 1%, that would be $1 trillion of revenue. And you and I both know, as an investor, if you're going to go invest in a company that only gets you a 1% return on assets, that's not good. He's like, we got $22 billion. That is disgraceful. We've obviously got to improve that to be much better for the American people.
Great.
So understanding that number, I think, is key. I would just say one last thing. People say, oh, it's going to be really hard. It's really hard to develop it. We did this in North Dakota. When I took office, they said, well, we have no way of knowing what our undeveloped minerals are. And we found a young software company that was able to figure out precisely what the future value of every one of the wells in North Dakota on public land would be worth. It's been used for estate planning. If grandma dies and she's only got a 10% of one well, they can figure out the value for that. If we can do that there, we can figure it out for the whole country. And just as I said to Speaker Johnson, we're required as a nation to conduct a census within every 10 years, not every 10 years, but within 10 years, do a census. That's hard work, but we figure out a way to do it. I would think if Congress stood up and said, hey, every agency, every bureau, every department of the United States government needs to figure out what their asset value is, then we get after it, and we get after it, and we come up with a number, and then we can make these trade-offs. When you do by executive order and take hundreds of millions of offshore subsurface out of leasing, and that's viewed as a costless event, at least we could have the trade-off of say, yes, some people thought it was important to take that off of the table, but what did it mean for the American people? Did we just take trillions of dollars of future revenue out of the pockets of our future generations? And so I think, again, creating a financial understanding that is where we can have an honest discussion about some of these executive actions that are happening at the end of this term, for example, would be useful for all Americans to understand.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I've got another.
I want to play for you one more exchange here. This is, again, in his confirmation hearing, then North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum, now our Secretary of Interior, in exchange with Senator Hoeven. Senator Hoeven asked him a question, and here is now Secretary Burgum's response. But I want you to listen for, because Senator Hoeven was also the governor of North Dakota, did a great job setting North Dakota up for success. You're going to hear Governor Burgum allude to that in a conversation around how much revenue is being generated for the K through 12 program in North Dakota.
Well, thank you, Senator Hoeven. The answer is obviously yes, but this is the public lands, and particularly when we talk about aspects of BLM, this is essential to local economies, and whether that's grazing rights that were part of this, whether it's recreation opportunities and access, whether it's timber, or whether it's oil and gas and mineral production that supports local economies and supports our country. This land was put away for the benefit, the use, and the enjoyment of the American people. Not every acre of federal land is a national park or a wilderness area. Some of those areas we have to absolutely protect for their precious stuff, but the rest of it, this is America's balance sheet. And I think every American during a presidential campaign finds out and gets pounded into their head that we've got $36 trillion in debt. We got all this debt. Oh, Americans, you owe part of this national debt, $36 trillion. This is on you. We never talk about the assets, and the assets are the land and minerals. This agency in Interior, the Department of Interior, has got close to 500 million acres of surface, 700 million acres of subsurface, and over 2 billion acres of offshore. 2 billion. That's the balance sheet of America. And if we were a company, they would look at us and say, wow, you are really restricting your balance sheet. And do you know what those assets are worth? We don't. I believe we ought to have a deep inventory of all the assets in America.
I just want you to take a moment and think about that. The numbers he just rattled off: 500 million in surface, 700 million in minerals, 2 billion in subs, and we don't know the value of that as a nation. Think about it. If you were a company, you didn't understand the value of your balance sheet. It's just so irresponsible.
We ought to understand maybe what are our assets? 100 trillion, 200 trillion? We could be in great shape as a country. But then if you said, wow, if we have 200 trillion in assets just sitting there, but we restrict access, we don't cut a tree, we don't use them for recreation, and then we don't develop the minerals sustainably in a smart way, then we're getting super low return for the American people. It's our responsibility to get a return for the American people when we do that. When we did that in North Dakota, you started it as governor. And on the land board, we've got, in our little state, we got a $12 billion endowment for K-12 for about 125,000 kids. I mean, we got an endowment bigger than most universities in the country for our K-12 system because we learned how to utilize this stuff. And guess what? We still have among the cleanest air, cleanest water, greatest recreation in the nation. This is the time of abundance. We can do all of it.
Yeah, and so it really
Just think about it, $12 billion for a K through 12. Like, you know, it's like 125,000 kids in the state of North Dakota. It is staggering how well that state is flourishing. Governor Doug Burgum, now Secretary of Interior, but also Senator Hoeven, former governor, did an outstanding job setting the state up for success. So I wanted to share this with you just to plant some seeds, pun intended, land, resource, assets, right? So that we can begin to look at, hey, what can we do to start to really understand what's on our balance sheet? And then how do we get a much better return on this balance sheet? One, to obviously pay down the debt, but two, I think we can get to a point if we actually start to manage these resources effectively where there's a citizen's dividend just like Alaska. Imagine the United States of America paying you a citizen's dividend because we do such an outstanding job managing the actual natural resources, God-given resources that are in this country. Now, take it one step further, think about a state like California. I mean, California is just one of the most amazing, blessed, beautiful states on the planet. And how could we do a better job to, one, obviously understand our balance sheet in the state, and then number two, to more effectively utilize those resources? Because we just heard this week, right? Governor Gavin Newsom talked about, I think it's a $12 to $16 billion budget deficit here in the state, which has got supposedly the fourth largest economy in the world. How does that make any sense? Oh, that's right. We're way overspending. I don't want to get into that right now, but when you think about the state of California alone, to better utilize the natural resources here, i.e. Alaska, i.e. North Dakota, what could be happening within the state to really see it flourish, its citizens flourish? And you want to talk about eradicating homelessness? Let's better utilize the actual resources that we have in the state to fill the coffers and take care of its citizens. So we'd love to know your thoughts. Please share your point of view. Please share this video with friends and colleagues. And thank you so much for joining me here on the Commercial